Hi everybody. So, the famous physicist Ernest Rutherford once said that all science is either physics or stamp collecting, which might explain why he didn't get invited to many biologists' parties. But you might say that's all very nice, but how does that relate to music? So I think things like chord scale theory try to be musical physics, and actually I think there's a lot to be said for stamp collecting. So I'll give you an example. I used to play with a fantastic traditional jazz clarinetist called Adrian Cox, who you might know from Kansas Smitty's house band. And like, he's probably one of the first jazz musicians I met who hadn't come through the, jazz performance diploma, or undergraduate degree or whatever sort of background. He hadn't been to jazz school, basically. So he just learnt by playing a zillion gigs and knowing a zillion tunes and, being great. Representing perhaps some of the older ways of learning that jazz musicians used to do before the sort of jazz educational military industrial complex became a big thing, and now we're all looking for gigs in that, including me. But it said like something very interesting. I remember him saying, I'm not sure exactly it was this, but something like this. If you're playing a tune in B flat and you come across a diminished chord, what do I play? Something he asked his teacher. And his teacher, who was also a great New Orleans style traditional jazz clarinetist, said, you just play D flat. That's actually great advice, because if you're playing a sort of typical kind of traditional jazz tune, where you're going to come across a diminished chord, it's typically either it's going to be E diminished in the key of B flat, or maybe D flat diminished seventh, and they're both basically the same chord, right? And they're inversions of the same thing. So if you play D flat over the top of that, it sounds great. I'm going. So on, right? So, of course, that's also a blue note. It's the minor third of the key. And to be honest with you, that's what I do when I come across a diminished chord now, is just play that note. This is not really a theoretical explanation. It is, in fact, of course, one of the chord tones of both diminished chords. But it's not... the explanation is not important. And this is something which I've been grappling with a bit, and I think people find a little bit almost like subversive or threatening, is it's the idea that actually you don't really need to explain music. The main thing you need to do is to know how to cope with things as they come along. And Adrian is one of the best jazz musicians I know, so one of the best musicians I know, so I don't think we need to be any kind of scientists. I think we're musicians, and I think one of the best things actually that you can practice is specific situations that come up a lot. A 2-5-1 is a really good example of that, right? If you learn how to play 2-5-1s, you're going to be, pretty happy on most standards, right? I mean, that's why it's become such a big thing in jazz education. It's actually a good bit of practical advice. You can see people like Dizzy Gillespie, for instance, using 2-5-1 licks in the composition of Groovin' High. It's something that does actually relate to that music. You can hear it and see it with your own eyes and ears. But I mean, the thing is that... sorry, I lost the plot there for a minute. Yeah. So I think this is something which you can expand as an idea. So, for instance, here's rules of thumb that you might have encountered from, playing jazz generally. And I think the rules of thumb thing is good. So, for instance, here's a rule of thumb. You can take any dominant chord and replace it with the same dominant chord, a flattened fifth, higher or lower. For instance, if I'm playing in C major and I play a G7, I can play a D flat 7 instead of some kind, 13, whatever. Okay. Well, that's very well known. That's the tritone substitution, as it's known, right? Okay. So that's one substitute, and that you can hear that in 1930s music. You can hear Django and the rest of them playing that. You hear that sound. It's there on the records, right? So that's one little nugget of information you can have that you can work on. And you can work on actually just as simply as just playing like triads, which sound great. You know, so for instance, I've got a D minor 2 5 1. Here I am playing my D minor 7 arpeggio. Okay, what happens next? Oh, I'm going to play a D flat arpeggio. And a resolve to C. Sounds great. Okay, so that's a useful rule of thumb. What's the next rule of thumb that we could use? Well, we could maybe think about using a minor instead of a dominant. So we could take advantage of the 2-5 relationship that I've talked about in another video. So instead of playing G7, we could play D minor. So that just means that we just play D minor again, right? A good sound for that is D minor 6th, which you hear from all the swing players, right? But you could also play D minor 7 and not bother going to the 6th. Or you could play any minor scale you like. And that sounds great too. You can use whatever minor language you've been spending time working on minor tunes and apply it there to a dominant. So that means you get like a free hit. You get loads of another application of all the stuff that you've been learning on a D minor chord can suddenly be used on a G7. Okay, well, what about if we put them together? So I play instead of relating G7 to D minor, I relate D flat 7 to A flat minor. What about that then? So oh, it sounds a bit interesting, but it works. Very cool. So this becomes a big thing in the 40s. That kind of stuff, right? Which today we would call something else, but I'm just bear with me. You probably know what all this stuff is theoretically, but I'm just giving you the rules of thumb, okay? Now, you might say, okay, well, in the 40s, people suddenly started realizing that if you end a phrase with the 5 triad on a minor chord, it sounds incredibly hip. Things like this, which is a real bebop sound, right? Okay, but then what if we put that on the G7? Oh, interesting. Okay. Doesn't quite resolve, but what if I use it D7, A flat minor, and then do the same thing? Okay. So, okay. So what I've just given you is the 3 rules of thumb. It's like tritone subs, 2-5 relationship, playing dominant major triad on a minor chord sounds incredibly cool. And you're free to combine those 3 things in any way that pleases you. Of course, what I've just given you is melodic minor harmony. But what I'm saying is that step-by-step approach gives you things you can play, okay? And that's what I really admire about things like the Barry Harris method, but also the way Jordan Clemens teaches, for instance. You know, there's lots of people who teach this kind of mindset in different ways. It's little bits of information you can actually apply, okay? And I think probably one of the biggest things that, and I don't think this is the fault of the educators, I never do, but one of the things is that people get like the musical physics tome, be it, the chord scale book or whatever, or, even if you put all of Barry Harris's sort of stuff together in a book, I could imagine that would be some horrible tome, some grimoire of confusion, which people look at and go, oh, I have to learn all this stuff. Whereas actually just going through it step by step and learning little nuggets of information, building up a picture. The point is that I'm not thinking about the melodic minor there, but what I'm playing is melodic minor harmony. And I'm just wondering, I just want people to give these rules of thumb a little bit more respect, because, you can do a lot with them. And they're great sort of vehicles for creativity. There's something about a rule of thumb is it's like saying, try this. See what this sounds like. Whereas I feel like these books of musical physics are telling you what you can and can't play. And that's why I think we should all be collectors rather than theorists when it comes to playing music.